the later one, the Grundrisse, neither of which he had an intention to publish, but both of which were essential to write out in the kind of detail he does, because his reading covers so many different disciplines, and he's looking for the interconnections between processes, and he's trying to make sense of the system, which is already in the 1844 manuscripts, the capitalist system, although one of the important differences that I see there in between the manuscripts and the later writings, it also includes a good deal of the system of class history, which overlaps with the capitalist system. So we get and indeed, even another system which is more general still, which overlaps the system of class history, which is the system of the human condition. This is the discussion of powers and needs of human beings. So you get, and so the manuscripts actually of 44 cover more of what is of interest to Marx than other writings. The German Ideology, which is a work that I would include among the published works, by the way, because he tried to publish it and couldn't find a publisher. But this is a work which actually is different than much of the later writings, because as well as being focused on capitalism as a system, it also, unlike most of the later writings, doesn't say much about class history. And so a lot of what's called historical materialism has to do with generalizations which apply to all of class history, of which capitalism is only one, and of course the most important example. Okay, now in the distinction which many people have referred to, it hasn't been referred to here yet, but very important in Marx's case, between inquiry and exposition. He knows there's a gap between how to think, how to organize the subject matter, the kind of categories to use when he's trying to understand it, but also when he's trying to present it to his target audiences. People who don't know much about capitalism, and certainly not much about the capitalist political economy, at least not in the way he has come to understand it, and more serious still, I would maintain, are not very dialectical. How do you begin to get them started to understand what he's come to understand in himself? And therefore, though Marx doesn't set this out when he makes that distinction between inquiry and exposition, I insert between the two this moment of self-verification represented by these two major unpublished writings, the 44 manuscripts and the Grundrisse. And then he has a task to try to popularize it to some degree with the help of Engels, who was a much better popularizer than Marx. And all popularization requires a certain degree of simplification, one-sidedness, and even vulgarization. I mean, all of us who've taught classes on Marx, or indeed any complex subject, know that you have to, what is the Chinese proverb? Every great journey begins with the first step. How do you get these people to take the first step? Well, you overstate things in one way or another. Marx does this as well, and actually he's much less successful, I think, than Engels as a popularizer. Think of his preface to the Critique of Political Economy, those few pages, which are the main source for so many anti-Marxist books, where he comes across as a pretty vulgar economic determinist. And they quote him to prove this. He says this in these 5 pages. This is Marx trying to summarize too much, more than he or anyone else could possibly do, and he gives material to too many anti-Marxists from then up to the present time, to the school of analytical Marxism, Jerry Cohn's school, Jerry Cohn's very important, influential book, Marx's Theory of History, is almost entirely based on those 5 pages, almost entirely, and he's not alone. Okay, so, but this is necessary. This is necessary to get people to begin to make sense of what you're talking about, and then hopefully, if they stick around, you can begin to qualify this. You can begin to introduce more dialectics. By the way, the works written for himself, for self-gratification, contain much more explicit dialectics. Many more. All the categories associated with dialectical method are found there, and they're used extensively in those 2 works, both the 44 manuscripts and the Grundrisse. Something else which has a key role in both, which doesn't come out so much published writing is the theory of alienation. This is why, 58 manuscripts can't be, Grundrisse can't be dismissed as an early work. It's full of the theory of alienation meant in exactly the same way, with some variations sometimes that you find talking about alienation in 1844. Then alienation, as well as some other categories, begin to get more restricted in what he's wanting to convey with a particular word, which brings me to another important reason for the changes the differences people see, that they misunderstand as changes. One of the things you can do dialectically, and have to do, if you understand the interrelatedness of your subjects, this complex number of processes which you at the same time you have to understand these interconnections. At the same time, you can't do it in one move. You've got to break things down through the process of abstraction, which he talks about, especially in his introduction to the Grundrisse. You've got to break things down. Now, in breaking things down, the words, the concepts you're going to be using are going to refer to something less than the full group of interconnections which they can convey, and often do convey for him, when he has not broken things down in quite that manner. So capital, you see, we know it's a social relation. But what he packs into that social relation at different times, in different contexts, differs. Vilfredo Pareto, the non-Marxist but very intelligent and learned sociologist from Italy in the early 20th century, put it very nicely, and I begin in my book Alienation with those words. For me, they were very important. He says Marx's words are like bats. You can see in them both birds and mice. And I think every serious reader of Marx has had that problem. And most people just pull their hair out at that point and settle for what they think is the most likely or the most frequent use of a particular kind. I'm talking about all of Marx's major concepts. And so, but Marx has to do this because he doesn't want to and can't talk about too much at any one time, and yet it's that too much that he needs to understand in its interconnectedness, in the way those interconnections are evolving. So you find that some examples from the manuscripts, since we're talking about the early Marx. In the manuscripts, of course, alienated labor is a key category, and private property is his way of talking about the products of that alienated labor. Now, people have pointed out that over time, Marx didn't stop completely, but stopped almost completely talking about alienated labor, and substitutes two expressions for parts of what he meant by alienated labor. This isn't something different. These are just elements of what he included within the cluster of relations which constituted alienated labor for him in the manuscripts of 44. I'm talking of the expressions labor power and abstract labor. And then people have said, look, Marx changed his mind. It's abstract labor which is now at the center of capital. Abstract labor, and it's usually understood to mean the availability to do any kind of work. You're offering your labor power, which is the ability to do work. But that ability to do work is an ability to do any kind of work because you're desperate. Okay, what gives people this ability and in fact a necessity to do any kind, to offer themselves to do any kind of work because they're desperate? It's the relations, the separation between the worker and the control over his productive activity, the separation between his productive activity and the products in terms of who gets the product, who controls it, who even determines where it goes in the marketplace. It's the separation between workers and their employers and the different interests that they have. It's the separation between the workers themselves because they're competing for jobs, for good jobs, for well-paying jobs, and it's the separation between workers and the species, or what it means to be a human being, the potential they have for different kinds of relations because they're human, for different kinds of relations with their activity, with the products of their activity, and with other people. Okay, these things are contained in the shadows of what he talks about as labor power. Labor power is an ability to do this kind of work, especially because it means when you are talking about the actualization of that power. It leads to abstract labor, which is a condition of that activity, which comes out of those relationships, which are the full set of relations that are made explicit in the 1844 manuscripts. Now, in Capital, and before Capital for something like labor power, he's already breaking down that larger notion of alienated labor into those bits which are most relevant to deal with the particular problem that he's concerned with at that time. So it's not right to speak about this as a change of mind. This is a change in the form that a cluster of relationships that he understands as being part of capitalism, breaking it up, abstracting a part of it for use of that part, because that's enough for him to deal with the particular problem he's dealing with. But to really understand what's going on, like to understand value, which is the product of alienated, not just abstract labor, it's the product of alienated labor. Value and dialectics is important here. I guess one form that my critique of Marxology takes is that there's an insufficient use of, and I suspect from an insufficient understanding of dialectics. What happens in capitalist production is that the first metamorphosis doesn't occur of the commodity or value. The first metamorphosis, transformation and transfer, occurs of alienated labor into all of its products. And that is the nature of value in general, and therefore is the value element in exchange value, surplus value, and even in use value, which also has a more general use to refer to pre-capitalist times. But within capitalism, you produce use values not for yourself, but for someone else, and that's part of the alienated relationships and what they require. You can't produce use values for yourself. In earlier pre-capitalist times, yes, a lot of production goes on, and Marx uses use values in a broader sense to refer to production use values for a producer. Okay, so how does alienated labor, which is an activity, get into its products and give them the form of value? It is a transfer of the very relationships which I just listed that constitute alienated labor. Dialectics allows and permits us to see the transfer of relationships through a system. This is part of what a system is. Relationships move through a system. And so they take different forms depending on where they get to, what function they are performing in that new place, and which group of people embodies that function. So you see alienated labor in value. You see it therefore in the different forms that value takes. As the commodity gets metamorphosed into capital, it gets metamorphosed into money, and they all contain alienated relationships, and therefore, and through them, the whole society becomes taken over by the violence of things, which is a way of talking, a way that he doesn't use in Capital. He also have this political writings, this appears. They then exercise power over the workers so that they are forced to reproduce the same kind of labor the next time they go to work. Because in Capital, although Volume 1 is primarily dealing with production, but the whole of Capital is dealing with reproduction of the system, as well as the production of the goods within the system at any given moment. And that reproduction occurs through the relations of alienated labor becoming general throughout the society, and not just in the economy. And as a result, the workers have no choice but to do tomorrow and the day after tomorrow to offer themselves to do, in the same way, to do any kind of work, and for as little for as much as they can get to do it, as they did yesterday and the day before yesterday. And this is a continuation of part of what he meant, not just in this case, about alienated labor and how it gets into and spread throughout the economy, but this is also a new way, a new expression for the understanding he already had in the 1844 manuscripts I started to of private property. Private property is at the core of what's called value. That is the relations of private property. So the worker can't use something, it belongs to someone else. And that someone else who gets in control of it, treats it like they treat private property. And it takes the form of value. They treat it as a way to make more value for themselves and more surplus value for themselves. So that the 1844 manuscripts is this first breakthrough based upon the reading that he's doing in the period before that, and his attempt to grasp this extraordinarily complex system in which he and we all still find ourselves, capitalism, to grasp that in a systematic, dialectically systematic way. And then he, in subsequent ways, often influenced by the occasion, because this also was an issue. What is the occasion for a particular work? If he's debating somebody, then who that person is, and not only Proudhon, but the person's political role in society and on the left at that time is important in how he formulates his views. And there may be changes, okay? I don't want to say that Marx doesn't change his mind about anything. He does. But I would start by saying, where does he admit that he changed his views? Even Engels, I would think, is a good source on that. And, we know some of the outstanding examples, the role of Irish nationalism, and the role that the role that the Irish workers he saw would play in any revolt in the British Isles. He thought that the revolt would come from England, and the Irish would participate in that. He began to see later that they had a more distinctive and decisive role in the start of any revolution. And there were a number of changes of this sort. But I feel, let me come at this is what Marx does all the time. Let me come at this from another angle. By the way, that's another way, this is not a change in view, this is an attempt to get some clarity on something, because approaching anything from one or even a couple of sides isn't enough. So let me come at what the thing is. No, I don't have that much time. Let me, tomorrow. These occasions, Communist Manifesto, he was asked to write a manifesto. Clearly a good deal of what he says there is an attempt to talk to a certain group of people, get them to understand some things which were more difficult than others, and also the polemical character of some of his works. This isn't a change of view, this has to do with who he's talking to, or trying to talk to. But it's also, we today learn rightly a great deal from not only things that he wrote for a particular audience, but things he wrote to a friend. And not only Engels, but he wrote to so many people, including to members of his family, and we're right to mine these letters for insights even to his theories. But we have to be careful of how we use them, because after all, the occasion and the form it takes is going to affect his wording and what he emphasizes, and this is okay. And this is something we can never dismiss. I want to end with this. I think one of Marx's greatest achievements in doing a dialectical study of capitalism and then giving us a dialectical analysis of it, and never in one place, even in all the volumes of Capital taken together, does all that he wanted to do. And what he does achieve is he manages for people who go into Marx by various paths. What he manages to achieve is he brings something in which we are all living, which is, for all of us, certainly at the beginning, hidden in plain sight. Hidden in plain sight, he begins to reveal it to us. And I would think, and by the way, in talking about Marx's analysis, there's a very important moment which he doesn't make sufficiently clear, but I see it there, which needs to be distinguished from his theories as explanations, which is the moment of revelation. Now I know the religious history of the word, and I'm cautious, but there is a moment of where he's helping us see what it is that needs to be explained. Because too often, again, in my own efforts to explain Marx, I often am talking to people who not only don't understand the theory because it's complex, they don't know what the hell I'm talking about. There is, I think, one example I often offer students, and I'll finish with this, and I think this is one of Marx's great achievements, to help reveal this system as something which is all over us, affects us in innumerable ways, and therefore needs the kind of explanation he offers and never finished, and we must continue to supply what's missing, and especially in terms of the age of. But you may have seen, most of you are almost my age, you may have seen the movie Harvey with Jimmy Stewart, where Jimmy Stewart, a movie from the 30s. I didn't see it then, but this is a great photo of place. Jimmy Stewart's best friend is a 6'2" white rabbit called Harvey. And Jimmy has these marvelous conversations with him, and he's a little drunk. And people, come up and they look at Jimmy and they look at the empty chair next to him, and they're wondering, who the hell is he talking to? What is this all about? And I have too often experienced in trying to explain Marx to students and others that they see what I'm talking about as a kind of empty chair. It's not just that they disagree with my description of the person, they don't see anyone there. And therefore, part of what Marx is doing early and late and throughout his writings and from various angles, and by breaking up capitalism in different ways, and by having words which are elastic. Marx's meanings, in effect, are elastic. They stretch, and they don't mean the exact opposite of what they meant a few pages back. I'm not talking about words used in different books, but words used in the same book concept, that in fact they include a little bit more or a little bit less of the interconnections which he himself has come to understand are there. And that's the way he can begin to get us to begin and move along and through that process of coming to understand this system. And Marx does this, and he made the big breakthrough in the 1844 manuscripts, and ever since then, what needs to be emphasized, because this is what's important for us today, is Marx's systemic understanding of the system of capitalism, so we can understand its problems and work in ways to help overturn it. And we must not make that more difficult by presenting Marx, breaking him up in ways, either strictly chronologically in terms of the writings, or by different theories which we treat too much as being relatively independent. They're not even that relatively independent. And we must not do that, because I think in many ways this increases people's difficulty, including the difficulty of the most educated among us, in actually grasping the systemic dialectical character of capitalism, his main project.
If you can do two things at once, I'm going to take questions, and also Marcello wants me to mention that these are for sale, so I'll circulate them and people can. Do you want to circulate them or take them? So should we take several at a time, and then we'll open to the panel? So let me go 1, 2, 3.
Thanks. I'll try and concisely build on some of what Bertell has said, although possibly also with some disagreement, but use it as a way to ask a question and pose a challenge to both Marcello and Norman. And in this regard, I think the thing that struck me most, and I would grab the most from Bertell's comments, is that the EPM is about more than capitalism. And what I have pointed to myself in looking at the manuscripts is particularly when he breaks off his section Wages of Labor, which is the first section, which is confronting basic issues that will, in fact, preoccupy him for the rest of his life. The question that he put, one of the two questions that he poses is, and it's actually a significant term, as Bertell pointed out, what is the meaning of this reduction of the greater part of humanity to abstract labor in the evolution of mankind? And the point of that question is it's not about capitalism only. It's about the history of class societies as part of the experience of humanity in total. And I've always been personally much more interested in the whole experience of our species. Been around for about 150,000 years. For about 10,000 years, we've suffered under states' power and exploitation. I don't want to restrict myself to the 150 years of capitalism. I don't even actually want to restrict myself to the 10,000 years of exploitation, but I do want to understand in the entire experience of humanity, what is the meaning of our having become exploiters of ourselves and the exploited for ourselves. So in this context, I think that the problem I have with what Marcello says is that I think it absolutely correctly points to the extent of really significant development after 1844 in Marx's critique of political economy. The critique starts in 1844, but in the manuscripts, there's no recognition of the law of value. There's no recognition of the commodification of labor power. These, of surplus, these are absolutely central developments and huge achievements that come later. And without them, without the idea of the law of value, the fetishism of quantities, one doesn't have anything substantial to say about capitalism as a system, as Marx does in Capital. So that's where the real achievement Marx has. But he nowhere in there goes beyond, in all of his work, the recognition that he also has in 1844 manuscripts, and this is something Bertell was referring to, that the alienation of labor is property. And actually, it's not, as you said in passing, that property is caused by alienation or expresses, and this is something that is recognized to be a problem. I think as Norman said, property breeds inequality. Marx very specifically rejected that notion and argued that property is the alienation of labor. And in the 1844 manuscripts, any of his later understanding of what capitalism is, he looks more broadly at what he refers to as the movement of property in history, which is to say the movement of class exploitation in history, and tries to conceive of that as an overall process. But he never does that later. I mean, he restricts himself, understandably, to capitalism. I've always been interested in trying to really understand the non-capitalist forms of class exploitation, the differences between them, the differences between them and capitalism, and forms of transition. And this is because, again, and so in this regard, I think there's a point that I like in what Marcello says, but at the same time, I think he's bent the stick. Bent the stick too far. With respect to Norman, I think the problem is that the recognition of 18th century materialism feeds into what I might call the non-Marxist reading of Marx, which is to say all of the 18th century materialists recognized the things that you said, but what they didn't recognize is alienation of labor. They didn't recognize that classes aren't just categories or stratum within society, but that class is a fundamentally polar relationship between exploiter and exploited, in a word, oppressor and oppressed. And that element is something that Marx introduces beginning in 1844. It doesn't have before then, but that is, to my mind, a radical transformation beyond anything that existed in the liberal materialists. Those liberal materialists even had the idea of bourgeois revolution. My particular bête noire which was completely without foundation because, among other things, it doesn't consider class in terms of exploitation. The two classes that are opposed don't exploit each other. They're both ruling classes, and it doesn't actually make any sense. And so all of what I would say is we need to go beyond the view that Marx was no more than a materialist, and I'll be quiet.
Thank you. Who was two? Was that you?
No?
Go ahead.
I actually have quite a kind of question,
Could you please
and not a
introduce
set
yourself?
of claims.
Could you introduce yourself?
My name is Carsten. I teach John Jay College and New School in New York. And what I actually want to do is provoke both Marcello and Bertell to confront each other's differences. But that, of course, requires that the differences be clear. As I understand it, Bertell, and I think I'm quoting one of the things you said, substitutes for alienated labor a set of other categories, but we see, maybe that's wrong, elements, but we see in that, for example, in value and the different forms that value takes, the concept of alienated labor is still there at the central core. If I understand, from which I extrapolate that in some sense the notion of concept of alienation in the manuscripts is still at the central core of Marxism in some sense. Now, maybe that's not right. I'll just pose what I think is one distinction. Marcello, it seems to me, while you allow for a substantive continuity, the formulation of alienation in the manuscripts, I forget how you said, is a kind of initial approximation or initial attempt. It clearly develops, which would imply that the concept in the manuscripts is not at the central core, and that perhaps even the concept, if I'm interpreting you right, the concept of alienation itself has changed. So that if something like that is correct between you, I'd like to know how you would argue for those two positions.
All right. Thank
Or
you.
maybe I'm misunderstanding, in which case I'd like to know that.
I've got two more going, and then you would be another round. So I think,
Yeah.
who's number three? Is that you?
Yeah, Kevin Anderson. I'll be very, very brief. Marcello, I think you have these three schools. In school one, the people who preferred the 1844 to the rest of them. I think that's maybe an empty signifier used by the people who oppose school three, which is the continuity school. When you actually investigate, there's very, very few. Like Erich Fromm, I've read a lot of his work, and I've never found a sentence that says the young Marx is better than capital. You're just not going to find it. But it's important in terms of framing of arguments, because since it's been framed that way, and it was framed that way long before Althusser by some of these people like Sidney Hook, viciously attacked Marcuse's book as early as 1941. Okay, so the framing means that whenever we talk about the young Marx, we're forced to defend that. In other words, is that really Marx, whatever? And it just, in terms of what Bertell was saying, then you have to then argue that there is this continuity instead of, it's a Marxian text, why not just look at it? When people look at the Civil War in France, they're not forced to say, is that the same or different from the Communist Manifesto? It's just like a Marxian text that we look at. And we frankly lost that battle. I mean, the Althusserians won, and they morphed, into the post-structuralist, postmodernists, and they don't like Marx because they think there's a continuity, but therefore they reject Marx.
Thank you. Who is fourth?
My name's Jordy. Just a very quick question for some people who know me here might be familiar with the question. I don't understand the note, often when one talks about a break or a difference or a change in Marx's output or development, enrichment, what have you, one always is thinking, one is talking about Althusser and then the late Marx, or to quote unquote the late Marx. I've been of the belief for some time, I don't have as much experience as some other folks here, that there was a substantive difference with the 1848 revolution and their failure. I'm wondering if anyone has any thoughts on that.
Okay, so that was our first four. Do you guys want to respond, and then we'll take another round if we have time?
Do you have time for 2 rounds?
I think so.
Yeah, so we'll do just 1 round.
Very dangerous. All right, so should I take a couple more questions?
I can hardly remember the ones that are there. We should answer.
All right, all right, answer fast, and I'll try and make her. I mean, officially we run until
7 minutes. Oh, actually, yeah, that's right.
Now.
We've run out.
So are you in agreement to take another 10 minutes?
Yes,
Because
yes.
it's lunchtime, we're not, who needs to eat, we're Marx's.
Because we don't have another panel.
Correct. So let's do a quick
I'd like to
answer.
rest my arm at
Take
some
another
point,
round,
but thanks.
and that'll be it. Okay, so do you want to go in order, Marcello, you want to? No.
I'll talk from the chair.
Is that all right, can you hear him?
I'll talk loudly. In relation to the Ollman, and then in relation to George's question, I find in a discussion, I'll get back to George in more detail in a second, a total absence of the phenomenology of spirit. I mean, it seems to me impossible to understand Marx's 44 manuscripts or his theory. I mean, where is Marx get his theory of alienation from? This is right out of, it is also out of Feuerbach, who Marx read very intensely, by the way, not just the Essence of Christianity, but many, at least 3 other works of Feuerbach. So the theory of alienation is something that Marx takes essentially from Hegel, and he applies it to economics. And at that point, George hit the nail on the head. The addition that Marx makes to 18th century materialism is Hegel's theory of labor. Hegel's theory of labor, if I make this very quickly, Hegel's theory of labor is really composed, if you read the phenomenology, Hegel's theory of labor is really composed of about 4 parts. Appropriation, objectification, alienation, reappropriation. In other words, if you read the phenomenology, Hegel has a theory of labor. Labor of consciousness, not a physical labor, the labor of consciousness, the labor of mind as it shapes reality. Not that mind does not invent reality, as Engels said, but mind shapes reality. And Marx takes that theory of labor, or the labor theory, and applies that to economics. That's something that the 18th century does not do, but Marx does. And Marx, at least Marx in the 1844 manuscripts, has that combination of 18th century social materialism, and the Hegelian theory of labor. If you read, and I forget which one it is, but it's in the 44 manuscripts. I forget the manuscript, but I'm absolutely certain about the quote. Marx says about Hegel that Hegel understood the theory of the economic theory of labor, and Marx was referring, I think, to Adam Smith. Oh no, I know what it was. Marx says that Hegel's phenomenology of mind is sort of an answer or a duplication of Smith or Ricardo. Now that's a paraphrase, but if you go carefully through the 44 manuscripts, you will see that Marx relates Hegel to 18th century economic theory. So that's it.
I wanted to avoid that, having just 7, 8 people here at the end after 30 minutes. I cannot respond to this seriously. 15 seconds per question. First, Kevin. Kevin, this differentiation in 3 schools is, of course, not my invention. You can find this in many reconstruction of the debates. If you take Ernest Mandel, making the formation of Marx, economical theory taught from 1843 to 2003, you will find this one. Of course, it's always complicated to collocate, part of Bertell in this category 1 and part of Bertell in category 3, or Fromm is the same. We should talk about this later, but if you take the Marx concept of man, maybe the most, surely the most widely read text of Erich Fromm, he quotes 35 times the EPM and 6 times capital out of 45 quotation from Marx. So EPM is 35 out of.
Come on.
I'll talk about this later, but the idea that this kind of alienation, that this kind of Marx is the final Marx, is very strong in Erich Fromm, in my point of view. I also have I don't think that we lost the battle. I think that we won the battle because the school of the continuity was the hegemonic school. Marxism lost the battle, and then that kind of reading was more strategic and useful. That kind of, post-structuralist, etc. 2 points for Bertell, if I may. First, why did you consider Marxology as one party? First of all, I believe you are also a Marxologist, because you are an interpreter of Marx, but Marxology is full of different components inside, and there is a big debate. And the other point that I also didn't understand, Marx, Engels is a better popularizer of Marx. I also don't agree on this point. What is the Communist Manifesto? It's the best popularization ever written by a scholar. Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto. What are the circulars? What are the addresses? Hundreds that Marx wrote for the First International. This is the best popularization, much, much better than Engels. On the final point, I try to provoke my 2 colleagues. I cannot say very much about this now. I will just say that I would agree with Bertell's sometimes not changes, sometimes we can say changes, many times, breaks, epistemological breaks. I already said I'm against on this. Bertell said differences. I would say radical, huge differences sometimes. For example, in 1844, Marx didn't even use the word capitalism. And I would agree that there is a breakthrough, but it's a first breakthrough. There would be many other. Bertell used this expression. And for me, the problem would be to overestimate and underestimate the importance of Marx's deriving. In the case of the continuity school, there is a problem of overestimation. This is also the case for Erich Fromm, Kevin. And, for me, there is a germinating, a growing of becoming of Marx theory. Bertell.
Given limited time and given also that Marcello liked the story about Harvey, let me offer a quick story of that sort in response to a lot of the things. You could see that some of the differences which are emerging here as those who want to understand what goes on inside the car which makes it run. I think it's important to open up the hood and look inside the engine and examine the relations between the elements in the engine, and those who are concerned with what are the reviews written by different people who have bought this kind of car, what are the early stage of how this changed from the previous model, and not enough attention, I'm not saying no attention, not enough attention to getting into the nitty-gritty of Marx's complex system, which is the only way not only to understand that system, but to understand something else which is given too much attention in most of the Marxology, and which I understand as not so much interpreting Marx directly, but interpreting him indirectly through organizing and publishing some part of his writings. This really is the only way to make sense of who to credit as an influence on Marx and to see where he was an influence and how much of an influence he was, and too much talk about the history. I know there's many historians and ideas in the room, but too much talk too soon about the sources of Marxism presents us with a Marxism, presents us with a view of Marx that we're in no position to judge because we haven't heard enough about what the Marxism is that was influenced in this way. So insofar as influences are important, most of them should come after the serious analysis of what goes on inside the engine that makes it work the way it does. I can't help but give a quick comment to George, who didn't ask me a
question because it might help him change the entire course of his work. Capitalism is by far the most important system in Marx and for us here today, and it's a system which exists inside a larger system, which is class history, and it is a part of that system as well, and both of these systems exist within a still larger system of the human condition. But each of these systems have a number of processes which are interrelated, and where you can only focus on them and grasp the importance of the dynamics which come out of their movement by dealing with them separately. And the one which should be dealt with first in most is capitalism, even though it comes last, because as Marx says, we learn about things which came earlier by seeing how they turned out. And this applies to even an adequate understanding of class history as well as the human condition by understanding better the laws of motion of capitalism, which is his closest thing he ever came to stating what he was about in making his analysis of capitalism.
Okay, let's do a quick run.
Yeah, mine is short, and I don't require any discussion of this, but this is something I've been thinking about for a while and doing it in a small way, and I think this is a good way to popularize it. First of all, alienation. Now, people alienated from being in control of their lives and their communal property by private property interests from thousands of years ago down to the present day. And slavery, initially slaves were being sold. They had no role at all in their selling of themselves. But in the capitalism, people are conditioned, they're indoctrinated to sell themselves through school, to found admissions, and sell themselves to employers. So slavery, we have to popularize that, I think, that idea. And then also how communal property was privatized to make it private property, because they're getting against occupiers now. Well, tell them, listen, how was this system set up? By private property occupying communal property. Now the Occupy movements around the world are thinking in terms of communal property overseeing private property, and the police are defending private property. And the role of police is to defend crime, not to prosecute crime.
Thank you. You didn't say who you are.
Oh, Kwame Samburu, Marxist since 1960, Marxist, Leninist, Trotskyist, still active, full retirement, and I'm fully involved in all these struggles, and I feel so great being here among all these people and hearing all your different views. Let's keep going.
And get the most wonderful sheep of
My name's Mark. I just wanted to, this isn't an underhanded way to smuggle in a polemic here. This is a genuine question. If the panel would acknowledge that there are epistemological ruptures in consciousness, in human consciousness, and if so, if we can acknowledge that Marx did not use the word capitalism even in 1844, and as Norman pointed out, he's dwelling in enlightenment thought. If we're going to link social consciousness to production, and if we are going to acknowledge ruptures, then is there one in Marx at all, and where would you locate it? And that's the answer.
I'll give my time to my colleagues. So Norman and Bertell.
All right, so those will be the last two questions. Yeah.
That's a very good question. I tend, my own predilection in this, and what I've done in my other writing and so forth, I stress the continuity. Obviously, Marx goes through various periods, but I mean, I interpret Das Kapital as Marx's reformulation of Hegel's phenomenology of mind. It's a theory, I mean, that's kind of poetic, but I think that's essentially what he does. The terms Marxology and Marx, for me, are very confusing at the present time, because as I grasp them, they don't encompass what I see Marx's major mission. And what I'm saying is that based upon my reading of Marx, which is, as I said several times, centered on, at this point, on the early Marx, Marx is not, for me, when he does it in 44, he's not talking about capitalism. His mission in 1844 is to invent a new system of political economy which derives from human labor. after he reaches that point, after he reaches that determination, that I am going to invent a new system of political economy, not Smith, not Ricardo, a new one, really based on labor. He then, if you want to call it a break, epistemological break, or continuity, I refer continuity, he then applies that to capital. And I don't read capital as a prediction of fall of capitalism. I don't read capital as a sense of historical continuity or a linear theory. This is an analytic of a singular political, singular economic system, using the methods that he created essentially in the 44 period.
My answer is, I find rupture too strong a word, but the closest we come to that is the Marx before the 1844 manuscripts and the Marx after the 1844 manuscripts. As for the mention of capital, most of his discussion of class history inside the 1844 manuscripts is of the capitalist state of class history. So though he doesn't do it in a way which allows him to, at that point, grasp the dynamics of the capitalist system, because there's too much class history in general that comes into it, he is still dealing primarily with capitalism, even in the work of 1844. So, and then he put the capitalist mode of production is the most an area of capitalism which he focuses. Capital is already referred to in 1844. So I don't see that as particularly important, that capitalism, which is a word he uses, but doesn't use very much, more often is the capitalist mode of production, which he uses, that he's involved in.
I want to just remind you, if you borrow one of these, bring it back or buy it, because we'd like you to buy it. Fabulous panel, thank you.